So I thought something would work. Let's try this. Okay, I'm going to stay out of full screen because I'm going to be jumping around to a bunch of different tabs as we go through this, looking at a lot of examples and inspecting a bunch of crap. So my name is Nathan Singleton. I work here at Weave as a senior front-end engineer. I've been doing front-end for about 10 years, but for a lot of that time I was also a UX designer, doing front-end and UX at the same time. So yeah, this is me. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm very active there, or Shady Moses on GitHub. So let's start with a little story. Let's think of a scenario. Often you're asked to build something and people want it fast, so jump in here and they say, hey, we need this little widget for this fake company called Monster Bill. This should be able to show up like embedded in someone else's website, or show up in feeds or in any number of different places. And so you're like, all right, here's the design, here's what it looks like, let's build it. And it's not unlikely that you end up with something like this. Let's make this bigger so you can see it. That's not any bigger. Go. So we'll get into React a little bit later. This one's done just with HTML and nothing else. I mean, it's not, but that's fine. So if you notice here, I've got it built. It's actually looking like we want. This is the real thing, and it works. But the problem is, it's super unusable. It's totally inaccessible. In fact, I can't even access these buttons. Like, I can't tab to it as a keyboard user. I get nothing. So I can go back and fix that. That's easy, right? Like, let's find my button. Here it is. And I'll add a tab index. We'll make that 0. Now I should be able to come back here, and now I can tap to my button. Cool. So that works. It's sort of accessible. But if I were to turn on voiceover, which I won't do because that's going to be super weird on this presentation, you wouldn't be able to find anything. And you wouldn't be able to jump to anything in the document. You would have no idea how to make sense of this. And that's for good reason, because I built it with divs. I can make it look exactly like I want. I got some spans in there too. There's actually, problem is this is not something that assistive devices or bots can make any sense of. And if you do this, you've got this thing called divitis. And it's highly contagious. And by that I mean, if it ends up in the code base, most people don't go and fix that, and so it just propagates, and then everyone gets it. And like, I can just go and just slap something in there, divs and spans. So it's okay. You're not alone. You're not the only person to do this. Let's take a look at some. It's a website you all know pretty well, I would think. Facebook. Makers of React. Let's take a look at what's going on here in this feed. If you look at these dev tools, what the hell is going on? It's all the way down. Like, all the way down. Look at this guy right here. Okay, there's an H5. Sweet, we got one thing that's semantic. What else we got here? This is a div, and then we got some paragraphs. Nice, but another div. And there's crazy stuff here. There's a div with a form, a div, and a div. It just goes on forever, right? And unfortunately, you'll find this on the majority of the websites you're going to visit. We'll look at a few more later, but if you look at Slack, you look at Twitter, you look at any of the things that you use very commonly frequently. It's like that. I'm going to guess that a whole bunch of what's going on here in Facebook is that these were things that were created with React prior to fragments being created. So you have a whole bunch of unnecessary containing elements. That's like, but just wanted to make it clear. This is something that happens a lot, but you know, the first part of recovery is recognizing the So there's a better way to do this. You can do it with less markup, and you get accessibility right out of the box. It's just by using the right HTML elements. So semantics, this is a word that is the branch of logic and linguistics that's concerned with meaning. And when we talk about it, if it's plural, then you're talking about the meaning of a word or a phrase or text. And that's just in everyday use, what semantics means. And so when we talk about semantic HTML, what we're talking about is markup that adds meaning and not just presentation. So it's something that can be understood by bots and assistive technologies. And that makes it so that your job is a lot easier. You don't have to do all the extra work of adding on a whole bunch of stuff that will make maybe your things work out right. So to be able to write semantic HTML, it helps to know what things are available. There are different types of content that you can be looking at and be trying to mark up. And so this is a graph that shows kind of the set of things that you'll be concerned about when you're marking up your web pages. Flow content is kind of the majority of the stuff, and it's really generic, but there are different groupings inside that, and some of these things overlap. Some sectioning elements don't belong in flow, but some do. And we'll go through, and we'll talk about these individually, and then look at some specific elements that you might not have heard of, or you just might not know what to do with them, or when to use them. So sectioning content, that's for, as it sounds like, creating new sections in a document. So these define the scope of the headers and the footers and other elements that might end up inside of these blocks, right? So that's things like article, aside, nav, section, and then also header and a footer. You'll notice that div isn't on here even though it's a block level element. It's because it doesn't create any new sectioning. A div is actually a meaningless element. Its sole purpose is for adding grouping around something to add style. That's really all it's for. But this also includes some subsectioning elements that fall into other categories like flow, and that's header and footer. So article is an interesting one, kind of a hotly debated one, has been since it came out. But this is the quote from the spec. It's a complete or self-contained composition in a document, page, application, or site. And the basic idea is it's something that is independent and potentially redistributable, either in syndication, meaning through RSS feeds, or we give some examples here, like a forum post, a magazine or newspaper article, a blog entry, a user-submitted comment, interactive widget, and so any other kind of independent item of content that could be used somewhere else. So for example, in that Facebook example we were looking at, that thing we were inspecting, that's an article. This is something that you could easily redistribute and make sense on its own. If you're looking at Twitter, every Twitter post could be an article, and probably should be. Aside's another one. You don't see a ton or often is used incorrectly. It's a portion of a document where the content is indirectly related to the document's main content or to the container, right? So if you're in a new section, the aside is indirectly related to the stuff that it's next to. Often that's like a sidebar or a callout box, and that's probably the most common use case. So we're in Slack all the time. This is the web view, but anytime you're using Slack, you're in a web view because it's just an Electron shell. But that little thread thing that pops up, that's a great use of an aside. It's not, it's a div right now. But it's related to the content that you're looking at, but you could be jumping through different conversations and that thread box still stays open. So it's only indirectly related. Another, this is from a list apart. They have this sidebar that shows up on the bottom that is kind of like what's next or related posts. Another good use case for an aside. So that's sectioning content. It's a smaller group. Heading content. These are just section titles. And as we said, they're relative to the closest containing or sectioning element. So if you just have an H1 in your body, that's going to be a heading for your page. If you have it inside of a section, it's a heading for that section. In an article, heading for that article. Which is why for a long time, there was this myth that was being propagated, which I actually was going on for a while. That you can have lots of H1s on a page and it's not a problem. Technically that should be true, but it's not because none of the bots that scrape websites actually behave that way. But technically everything that creates a new section should have its own new set of heading ordering, right? So that you can start over again. But in general, the best practice when you're dealing with SEO, which is another reason why you should have semantic HTML, you want to have only one H1 per page, and then beyond that, you want to kind of keep the order the same. So it's H2s, don't have an H3 before an H2, that kind of thing. Heading content, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You may not have heard of the H group. It's one that's actually available, but it's not really recommended because they decided not to do it anymore, but it's in browsers. It's basically just a wrapper around headings. If you have multiple headings for a section, like a main header, subheader, another one, you could have as many as you want, and the H group is for marking that up.
The recommendation is to use, if you're going to have like 3 headers on a section, is just to have an H1, H2, H3, or without the H group, or you know?
Yep. That was the recommendation now. I think they decided that it didn't actually need to exist after they built it, or after they recommended it and browsers already implemented it. So flow content, as you can see, is a ton of stuff. And I actually removed a few things here that you can use, but that are just deprecated and you shouldn't be using. But there are a few things in there that are deprecated that you probably also shouldn't be using, like the B tag. This is a ton of stuff. And this isn't super useful, so let's break it into some smaller sections. You've got structural elements, which aren't sectioning. They don't create like new blocks. They don't change the way that headings behave, but they do add structure to a page. Like address, that's for marking up information about an article or about a page, as in like who wrote it, how you can get a hold of them. Not actually for marking up physical addresses. The header, footer, main is an interesting one. That's one that just says, hey, I'm the main block of content on the page. It shouldn't have anything that is repeated across pages, like if you've got a main banner with your navigation, or if you've got a sidebar that stays across all your pages, it doesn't belong in main, and there should only be one main in a document. And then nav is for marking up navigation. Not everything that is navigation should be in a nav, but things that kind of move from one portion of a document go in there. We also have text elements, and if you see there are a lot of these, it's actually probably 50% of the elements that are available are specifically for marking up text. There are lots of things you can do. One that I used recently, and a coworker was like, what is that? Is time. This is an element. The purpose of it is to mark up dates or times, and it has an attribute you can put on it that's called datetime that has a computer readable format, and then what you display is human readable. So that also makes it easier for things that are scraping or trying to index your page. As you see, there's a lot of stuff here that gives you a lot of help for marking that content as text. You've got lists, like a DL, an OL, and a UL. We'll actually look at the interesting use of DL in a minute. And then images. Canvas is technically an image. Figure is kind of a blocking, it's a wrapping element for putting images inside of, and that can have captions. And then you've also got maps, so you can have kind of interactive regions on an image. This should also include the picture. The picture element is new-ish. Not every browser supports it, but it's a way to do nice responsive images that can load actually different images depending on the size of the screen. And then obviously all the form stuff for collecting user input, and then you have embeddables, which you don't tend to use a ton, but I'm using one. You know, code sandbox stuff like iframes are used pretty heavily. Audio, and then video as well, if you're showing any videos. But interactive content, kind of a key one. The two biggest ones here are the link and the button. If you have a link to another part of your page, using an A tag. If it's a button, it should probably be a button and not something else. Otherwise, you just have to bring a whole lot of extra code to make it work like a button when a button just works. Details is a weird one. It's basically a built-in accordion or toggle. You can have a summary inside of it that's basically just the header that it shows, and when you click on it, it'll drop down the content that's inside of your details. Embed's another one. That's for throwing PDFs or other things in there, and some of the rest of these. Label is an interesting one. This is interactive content because if you mark it up correctly, clicking the label will bring you to the field that you're marking up. Like if it's an input, you click the label, it'll focus on the field. Or if it's a radio button or a checkbox, it'll actually make a selection. And then phrasing content. And I added this one here because it's kind of a critical distinction. Phrasing content is this is all the stuff that you can put inside of other elements. Not all, but certain ones, including P. And we're going to talk about the P tag in a little bit. You should be using more P tags most likely. But this is all the stuff that you can put inside a P tag. And if you're looking at like MDN's docs and you look at the P tags description, you look at also phrasing contents description, it talks about how runs of phrasing context make up paragraphs. So if you just have a bunch of loose stuff hanging around that's like, you've got some buttons or you've got like a time and stuff that you wouldn't necessarily put on its own inside of a paragraph because you're thinking this isn't a paragraph of text. It's not exactly what a paragraph is for. It's just for marking up a container for phrasing content, which is a whole bunch of stuff.
It's like the WBR.
WBR? You know what? I don't remember exactly. Let's look it up. There are a number of them that I left in there, but I've never used myself. It's a Wordbreak opportunity. That's a new one, actually. If you've got a bunch of content that you potentially want to break a certain way when it's small, put those in there, and then it can use those to break that content. I've never done it, but that sounds actually useful if you're doing certain design things. So let's look at that same widget, but with semantic HTML. Notice that it's quite a bit less markup. Way less. It's an article, because this is something that we can redistribute. And it has a header, so that's where we're going to be putting, in this case, our H1, because most likely it's embedded. It's going to be so. We've got a time there, because there was a little date. So I've got the actual time right here, and I'm printing it out exactly the same for computers and humans. Then that little line item list, I turned into a DL. A DL is a definition list where you have a DT, which is the term, and a DD, which is the definition. And most often you'll think of that as like you're actually defining text, you're defining terms, and you've got a definition. But this is a perfect use case for it, because if you look at this is the thing and this is the cost. Semantically, I think that works just fine. And the nice thing is I can get this kind of layout without having to put divs around all of them, without having a whole bunch of extra markup. Now you could put divs around these if you wanted, around your DT and DDs, and that would be fine. But it is unnecessary in this kind of setup because of the magic of Flexbox. If you want to look at how that's working, we can inspect that. And you can see that the DTs, I've used Flex inside the DL, so everything inside of it is inside a Flex container. And the DT's Flex basis is set to be 65%, and then the DD is set to be nothing, right? Just it's the rest. And so that automatically breaks things the way we want. And then I've set it to be to where they're justifying space between, or sorry, space, a space between. So it's basically pushing them as far out as it can, right? And then inside of this DT, that little line that's happening, that's just a pseudo element. Pseudo elements are crazy useful if you want to have a bunch of design things that have no meaning, they're purely visual, and you don't want to have to add extra markup for that to happen. And we'll also look at some examples of that. So this is kind of the difference, and you can see that all of this just works out of the box. I get my focusing, and if I were to read it with voiceover, it would actually read through it and everything would be given to me. So here's another example. Facebook. Here's a little face clone with a semantic feed. And if you remember what we looked at in the insanity of divs, there were so many of them. This is what it could look like. Actually, let's inspect that before we can smell it. So this feed, we've just got our header up here. We've got our main, which is, seems kind of off. But we've got this section inside of our main, because in Facebook there are actually sidebars and things that don't carry over between pages and would belong there. But this section is where the feed is, and then it's just articles. And each of those articles is way smaller, way easier to make sense of, and also a lot easier to navigate with assistive devices without having to add a whole lot of extra code. And this is just by looking at the design and seeing what's the meaning of this element, and what should I actually put here. So now that we've kind of did a whirlwind tour of HTML elements, we look at some principles for semantic components, and here we're going to actually look at a lot more examples that might be they're specific to React, but you could do this regardless of the framework you're using, or if you're not using a framework, it doesn't really matter. But some of these are specific to using a JavaScript framework. So the first principle is use meaningful markup. So you got to know your HTML elements, and then you want to look at the design holistically. I know when you're writing components, you're looking at that component and you're just thinking, what should I build here? But if you want to know the meaning of that stuff, it really helps to look at where that's going to be used in the larger design, right? So in the entire page, where does this belong? What are some of the use cases? What are the pages that end up in? That's going to help a ton to figure out what markup is the most meaningful. But here's some things to consider when you're thinking about using meaningful elements. Use interactive elements. Is it a link? Use a link. Is it a button? Use a button. You get a whole lot out of just doing that. That goes a really long way. If it's a text element, use text elements for marking up text content. This top one, there is no circumstance under which a text should be a direct child of a div. None. That should never happen. That's insane. It should be inside of something else that's for marking up text, right? And I'm going to read a quote to you because this is kind of a critical thing. Because paragraphs are actually used by assistive devices as things you can jump to. If you've wrapped content inside of a P, assistive devices have a way for people to jump to different sections of content. And if you don't have anything wrapped in a P, you got nothing to jump to. Paragraphs are inherently built for people to just skip through content from paragraph to paragraph to paragraph, so it's easier to read. I don't know how many of you have ever used an assistive device for testing or anything like that. A lot of respect for people who have to do that. It's tough. And I feel like the onus is on us to not make their lives harder. So wrap your content in things that make sense. A div with text, just don't do it. Be better than that. So paragraph is the workhorse of flow content. You should be using way more paragraphs than you probably think you should. And this is actually where the quote came from. So this is what Mozilla Developer Network, the MDN docs say about a P tag, which is straight from the actual WC3. They say the HTML P element represents a paragraph, usually represented as blocks of text, separated from adjacent blocks by blank lines and or first line indentation, but HTML paragraphs can be any structural grouping of related content, such as images or form fields. There is a specific element for like putting a bunch of fields together, grouping them. So you have a field set, which comes with some funky styling that you may not want. A paragraph also gives you a similar bit of functionality in that people could jump straight to those blocks and you can group logical sets of fields that way. And then also, it says screen readers and other assistive technology provide shortcuts to let their user skip to the next or previous paragraph so they can skim content faster. So respect the P tag and probably reach for that a lot more often. If you're thinking, I don't know what this is, I'll put it in a div, you're way better off instead putting it in a P. You just have to remember, if you haven't brought a CSS reset, it's going to wipe some of those things out. Paragraphs do come with some built-in styling, like margins on the top and the bottom and font sizes. So the second principle We're using meaningful markup. Now let's write less markup. Less is definitely more. Yeah.
Sorry, back to your point here about p tags. I'm a little confused because you're saying like, adds margins. What if I don't want to add margins, but I want text? What do I do?
Just remove the styling.
Make classes for all my p tag for all the places that I don't want my margin.
So the way the cascade works is you can have a style just generic p that's going to remove things. Generally, you wouldn't want to do that. If you're working in components, it depends on how you're set up, but using the built-in cascade of CSS in the component land tends to be more problematic than helpful. So you could just define a component, but for the most part, it's going to be a call you make. You're usually wanting space between the elements that you're marking up anyway, and you were going to write it. You're going to throw a div in there, and you're going to add some freaking margin to it, right? So a p tag, you do the same, but it just already has margin. You would just adjust what that is.
And a lot of CSS resets give you more sensible defaults than the browsers are going to give you anyways. So in modern development, you're using some sort of something that's changing that styling, whether you're using normalized.css or whatever that is, right? And rather than giving you like 50 pixels or whatever the standard is, it's probably like 5 and it's closer to what you want. If not, I mean, set a global rule and take them all out and then you never have to think about it again. And they function just like a div, but they work with readers.
And if you're curious about the standard, it's 1 rem or 1 m, I guess. So it'll give you whatever you set the font size of your p tag. Spacing on the top and bottom will be that amount. Right? So you can remove that if you want, but generally you want that there when you're dealing with runs, blocks of stuff, or you were already going to be defining some kind of spacing anyway. So it would be the same. It's just instead of a div tag with a class on it, it's a p tag with a class on it. You're just changing the element. Does that help answer your question? Okay. If you're talking specifically React, fragment is one of the key ways that you're going to be able to write less markup. Your components shouldn't have wrapping like containing elements unless they need them. This is what a fragment's for. So previously, prior to what, version 15, you couldn't return something from a function without it being a single element. That's just a constraint from JSX, right? You could return arrays of things, which essentially behave like fragments, but then you had to have keys on stuff, and that just wasn't always feasible. So fragment, you should probably use a lot more of those if you're writing React and you need siblings without that wrapping container all the time.
You're saying this should be like our base div for our components that we're in React. Instead of a div, it should be a fragment.
Totally depends on the situation. If you were adding a div simply to wrap it, for the sake of wrapping it, yeah, don't do that. Just make it a fragment. But if there was a reason that those things needed to be inside of a container, pick the right container for it, which may be a div, but more likely than not, there's something else that's more meaningful.
We shouldn't be thinking in terms of defaults. We should take each component on its own.
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of a big part of this is to write semantic markup and to have pages that are marked up nicely so that this stuff just works. It does take a little more forethought when you're actually sitting down to write a component. And sometimes it's often going to mean if you jump into someone else's component and you can reasonably remove things, you should. But if that's going to cause problems, obviously, don't do that.
I was just going to mention, I've used fragments for grouping things, and like a really simplistic example would be if I was just returning a button as my component, I'd return that as the a button element. But if I had like 3 buttons, I just wrap it inside of a fragment, return 3 buttons.
Yeah. Example. But the key here is you probably can get away with a lot less markup than you think. And if you're moving away from just wrapping everything in divs, you're automatically going to have less markup. And less markup is more performant. It's less stuff you're shipping to the browser. And the DOM can get crazy bogged down based on the number of elements. So the more elements in the DOM, the slower everything's going to move. We ran into this issue when I first came on, and we had this list that's like an infinitely loading list. And as soon as you reached around 500 items, the scrolling behavior just got nuts, right? Because each of those items had a whole bunch of stuff in it. So it's however many elements were inside of one of those items times the number of the list, right? And so everything just gets a lot slower if you have more markup. So writing less markup is inherently more performant. Use pseudo elements liberally. I use these all the time for all kinds of things, but these are, when you need purely visual elements and you don't want to add markup, this is what you need right here. There is a caveat here. Don't use pseudo elements for anything that needs to be accessible. This is purely visual only things. Like if it's got text in it, and that text is something a screen reader should be able to pick up, it's not what you need a pseudo element. That's not a pseudo element. But if it's just visual stuff, this is what you got right here. So let's look at a couple examples of some fairly common things that you could do with pseudo elements. Navigation active states. All this purple stuff that's going on here is pseudo elements, including this one down here sliding around. There's no extra markup there. Like we can look at this guy. Actually, let's go to the actual thing right here. So if you want to look at that component, the active nav. This is it. We've got a nav, and for each item, I'm rendering an A tag. I did have to add a span around this stuff inside it. That was the only extra thing I had to do, but that was so that I could position on top of the element that's underneath. But I only had to do that for this top one because that thing is inside it, and it's got a transform on it, which totally jacks up the stacking order of things. But in the second case, with this sliding stuff right here, notice I didn't need a span. You just have the content directly inside of it. And this right here is just, for some reason, it doesn't always work in the sandbox. That thing right there is just inside the container. It's an after on the nav, and it knows that it's as wide as one of the elements inside it because they're all in a flex container, and their flex basis is 25%. And then it just slides around depending on my state, which one is active. It knows how to position itself with the transform, translate X. Notification badges, these little guys here with the numbers, maybe those need to be accessible. If they did, you wouldn't want to use a pseudo element. But if it's just this little thing, like an indicator that you've got some activity there, pseudo element. That's great because you can just add no content, but then it's a new thing that you can give width and height and backgrounds and any other CSS things you can do to a pseudo element. And this number here, by the way, is part of the pseudo element. The content came from a data attribute. So let's look at that one. We got our notification badges. So which one is it? The first one. So if you look at this guy here, I've got this after, and its content is based on an attribute that's on the element. So it's just a data attribute. It reads that, prints it out, and I can tell it how big I want it, what font, all the things that you can do to any normal amount of text, right? And if any of this looks new to you, this is all using emotion, which if you're looking for a styled components library, I would highly recommend it. Another thing that is probably one of the most common use cases I've had for it is adding arrows. It's just like stupid little things inside of a tooltip. That's a CSS arrow, and it's a pseudo element, right? And you can have multiple of those if you want, because you can have it before and after, which means you could get like a shadow effect. You could get all kinds of double arrows and cool stuff, whatever you want to do. We looked at this one before, but that space in between with the dotted line, that's a pseudo element, purely visual. There's no reason you should be adding an extra element for that. Pseudo elements do it. And also these ones right here, separators in between things, like if you're looking at a nav and it's got little separators, those are all things you can do with pseudo elements. So use pseudo elements more liberally. You can save yourself a lot of added markup. It's just the embedded version. So another one, principle 4, is stay small and compose. I don't know how often you've looked at a component that's really big. I was looking at one today called Emoji Mart, trying to figure out how to add new emojis to it. It's enormous, and the props API is enormous. It makes this component incredibly difficult to ever update and also to make any sense of and to customize. And that's the problem with big components. If you make really large components, you have to add a bunch of props to let people get at the things inside of them. So there are much better ways to handle this, much better ways to handle this. We'll talk about it in just a second after the next principle. We'll look at some examples. But the idea is you want your components to be concerned with as little as they need to, and then you just compose those together inside of other components that bring smaller pieces together into a larger one, right? And in a lot of cases, you'll be able to have a ton of really small components, and then most of what you're bringing together is a page, or like one big section of a page that just brings in a lot of small stuff, rather than having to have big components with giant APIs. And along with that, keeping things small, a really big way that you're going to be able to add a lot of flexibility without adding extra markup or a lot of headaches and keeping things semantic is you want some same defaults for what you're going to do normally, but you add overrides. So element and style overrides plus rest props. And I'll show you what I mean by this. So if we're looking at a whole bunch of examples here, let's look at this first, sorry. So this whole website here is built with a pattern called compound. I'm not sure if this is something you've heard of. I've used a number of different versions of this as React has gone along and gotten a little bit better with the way context is handled. Having to like look at children and recreate them and pass new props. It's a lot nicer now. A compound component is essentially a grouping of small components that's exposed as a single component, and all the little small pieces you want to get at or use or mess with are either just made available via an index file, like in this top example. You can import all the things that you need that all work together, or you can export it as properties on a single element, which is the format I usually prefer. I think it makes a lot more sense. It's a little clearer what's going on than having to remember to bring a bunch of elements. But the idea is a lot of small components that work together as a larger component. And the nice thing about this format is rather than having page, and you have to pass like action left, action right, header style, and like you gotta add a million things to be able to customize the pieces that are inside of this component. Now you don't have to do that because each one of those is a component, and you can pass props directly to it instead of to the parent. You don't have to go through that middleman. So all the pages in this little example are using this actual page component, which I'll show you in a second. And it has different things it can do, like it can have a sidebar. And that sidebar can be custom styled, and it's super easy. Another example is this accordion. So accordions are a fairly common thing, right? You want to hide some content until the user wants to see it, but you want to keep it accessible. A compound component is a great way to do that because, for example, this component here, I only want one open at a time, but maybe I want multiple open at a time. And it's highly likely, depending on where this is at in the document, that I'm going to want different elements for my title and for the thing that's expanding, like where my content is. Sometimes maybe I want this to be a UL with LIs, right? Or maybe I want a header as a title. Depending on where it's at in the document, you need a different heading element. So element overrides are going to make that possible. And we can do the same with a card grid. So this one at the top has element overrides. This is its default. It's a containing div with some articles. And then this is a custom one. It's a UL where the cards are LIs. And this is all done fairly simply. So here are the compound components. Let's take a look at the page. Page right here. So the page element itself is just a styled component. It's fairly simple. It's just setting up a flex container, but then it's exposing these other components as properties of itself. So you've got this header and this body. And so we'll look at the header. And this component's doing a bit more. Because if you notice on some of these things right here, depending on the page I was on, there was a back arrow. And I could go back to the previous thing. How that behaves can be custom defined. So this page header has its own props, and I can pass them directly to it with this format instead of having to go through page. So this is just way more flexible. And this one, it turns out, doesn't really need to have any element overrides, but it is using an element that has overrides, which is this heading element. It has some variants. Look at that. I guess we'll just look at that right now. This is a generic like heading. It's styled for the things we want. There's a page style, section style, subsection style. But you'll notice that I've set it up to where the variants have both a style and a default heading level, because I can override the heading level but get the same style if I want. It's super flexible. And then you can also stay semantic. You're using a heading, which is what you want, and you can use the right heading level for the use case, but still get the style you want. So notice this component, it does accept a variant, but it also accepts a heading level, and it just uses a default based on the variant, but you can override it. And then it also has this rest that it can pass in. This is how you're going to get style overrides really easily if you're using something like the latest version of Emotion. You don't have to like peel off a class name separately and use CX to merge it in. You just pass it through and it merges it in automatically. Or if you wanted to pass style through, or any other attributes that are part of this wrapping element that someone might decide they want to use, you can easily get those passed through without having to define them in your props API using REST props. Now this can bite you. If it means that you might have elements that end up having attributes printed on them that aren't valid HTML attributes. If you're passing stuff that's not valid HTML attributes, right? That's kind of the only drawback. Again, the page body, this one's interesting because it takes a sidebar as an optional thing. And the sidebar is just a component. And if it has a sidebar, it's a function. It'll call that function and it'll pass in a component for you to use. You can then take that component and render it and pass stuff to it. Let me show you a use of this on pages. So like in the settings page, notice this is page body and it's got this function for the sidebar. And the sidebar is being passed in, and now I can pass custom styles to it. So I could have also made that just a prop that I could pass in sidebar as just a function or just a component that would render it straight up, right? But this is nice because you can provide a default that can be overridden. So you can have those styles that would be there automatically normally, which is what the account one looks like. Like this is the default style, and then this is the custom style. Let's look at the accordion. This one's interesting. In this case, the accordion is using some hooks to set some things up and track what's open and what's not. But the accordion component itself does not bring any HTML. It's just a controller, sets up a context provider, and then it exposes these accordion summary and accordion details, which kind of follows the naming of how things are in HTML. And so then the accordion summary pulls things down from context to know how to behave, but it can be overridden. Its default is it's an H4. I don't know if that's a reasonable default, but you can decide for your context what a reasonable default would be, but then you can override it. And so this is the pattern with these element overrides. You have a prop called element or component, whatever you want to call it. It's lowercase, it's a string, and it represents a DOM element that you want to have be used. And then all you do is you'd have to define it with a capital letter so that JSX knows it's a component and not an HTML element that's not real. But that's really all you have to do. Then you have element overrides. And we've got these REST props, so I can also just pass whatever styles I want to it. And then the details is a little expander thing, and here I've brought in React Spring to do some animation to make that work out nice. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And then the same with the card grid. The card grid has an element override, and all it really does is add styles. And this is maybe it's a fairly naive approach to how you'd want to do a card grid. This is using CSS columns, so a column count, which is how you can take like text and break it into multiple columns instead of having it be one, and instead of having to actually have a wrapping div and add a bunch of different paragraphs, right? So you could have it split it into columns automatically. I had to do a little bit of funny things to make it actually work out like this, and the order goes top to bottom, left to right, instead of left to right, top to bottom. But anyway, the purpose was to show that we've got these element overrides, both for the card grid and for the card. And really the card, you could bring your own component for this if you wanted. That's totally different. It would just have to implement a similar API, and then it would have to accept this gutter prop so that it knows what to do. But when we have these element overrides, there's really not a need for the creation of a lot of custom components. Or you can create a custom component that just wraps card grid and passes specific stuff to it. So, last one. You can use hooks instead of actually writing components for a lot of stuff. You can level up the flexibility of what you're doing by decoupling. If you're using React, you decouple the behavior that you want to make reusable from the markup using a hook. And then anyone can create whatever components they want, but still get all the same functionality. This is a pattern that I really love. Like, I'm not a fan at all, really, of using third-party UI libraries. They bring way too much stuff, and you always have to customize the crap out of them, and it's never exactly right. But there are lots of libraries that instead just export really low-level components that don't bring any HTML or styling, but give you all the functionality. Great one I can think of is Downshift from Kent Dodds, which is for creating accessible combo boxes, right? Like a search that has an auto or drop-downs that are custom drop-downs instead of a default select. There's not a hooks version of that, but that could very easily be a hooks version, and that's kind of the use case there. Anything where you just want all of the accessibility props and the functionality, you don't want any of the markup because you know it's going to be custom. Move it into a hook, and then everyone can build their own custom stuff off of it. This is the accordion example done as a hook instead of as a component. So here, with the way it's set up, you actually create a single accordion item with the hook. You could easily update it to not do that. But then because it's a hook, the controlling parent, like the containing parent component, can control it. So I can open all of them, I can close all of them, right? Because it's just a hook that exposes functionality, and I use the props it sends back, put it on whatever HTML I want. As long as I put it in the right place, it works. And this is what that looks like. Go out here. So here's the hook. It's fairly simple. This hook happens to have the animation stuff embedded in it, so you don't have to worry about it. But you don't have to do that, because that is part of the functionality, but it's not necessarily a critical concern. But notice what it's returning is the ability to toggle it, so you can turn it off and on, whether or not it's currently visible. And then it's taken some things and bundled them up as trigger props or container props, so you know where to put them. Container being the actual expanding thing, the trigger being the title or whatever that makes it expand or close. And so then if you want to use that, you would just come here like this, and I've got an array of accordions that I've created, and then I've got a function I set up to toggle all the accordions off or on, depending on what I want to do, set it true or false. And it just does it. And then for each of those accordions, I've got these animated divs, and I merge the props, I spread them in, trigger props, and the container props. So those are some ways specific to React that you can keep things semantic, keep things super flexible so that you don't have to have a bunch of crazy stuff hanging around. No wrapping elements if you don't need them. Use hooks, use compound components with same defaults and overrides. And that's going to get you a really, really long way in the React world for keeping your components nice and semantic. Keep them small, composable, like all this stuff right here, these components are super small, crazy flexible and customizable. You can create as many different versions of these as you can possibly imagine, but you don't have to rewrite any of the functionality, either with the hooks version or with the components that have overrides. And that is kind of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. We could do some exercises if you want, or you can get out of here. I was just going to look at 2 websites, and we were going to kind of go through, and you can tell me what you think you would do HTML-wise. And I would bet what you're going to guess is not what they've done. So let's look at a few. This is one. It's fairly simple, but it's interesting. It's called Interface Lovers. It's just interviews with designers. It's got like links to mixes on Spotify. But it's kind of some interesting behavior there, the way things kind of stick as you scroll. But this right here, this is a good one to look at. Marketing content and like editorial content is a lot easier to do semantic elements, semantic HTML for than saying it like an application, like doing something. It's not really easy to tell what the meaning is. This is a good starting point. So what do you think for the top up here? What would you do? A header, a div. Yes, a div. I mean, a header. Yeah, and that header would just be like directly in the body because that's your main header. If you wanted to let assistive devices know, then you'd stick a roll of what? Anyone know? Anyone know their landmark roles? It's okay if you don't. Accessibility is a whole other beast. But that would be banner is the role you'd have there. That's like, this is the main navigation header thing. Okay, what about this guy over here? Well, the links are. Now, how would you do that inside? Would you just throw a bunch of A's in there? How would you organize that? Thoughts? Just a bunch of A's? Yeah, totally works. You could wrap it in more stuff if you want, but it's pretty simple. In the past, I used to like to put things like that in lists, like an unordered list, but it's totally unnecessary. Okay, what about this area right here? Just below the header. What's that?
Section?
Section? Yeah, you're probably gonna have a section in there. That's a great candidate for main. That's the main content. That's kind of the thrust of what you're trying to look at here. And then I would probably break these into sections. Yeah, so like this guy here is your first section. This would be your second section. But then you're right, each of these, that really makes sense as an article. So what would you do for this image? Curious. How would you handle images in this case? Because this is the part about this website that's set up kind of interesting and not in a good way.
I don't know, an image with something under it.
This one in particular, if you look at that, they've got a div as a container, as we would expect. They've got an A tag that's an overlay. Interesting. That's an interesting approach of not putting things inside of an A that don't belong in an A, right? But that's so that the whole thing is clickable. That's cool. That works. Problem with that is it makes it so the text isn't selectable. And you could do the exact same thing without an A because there's a button in there, right? Or a link. And you could just use a pseudo element to do the exact same thing from that button without the extra A tag or from the link. Right? But yeah, what they've done is they've got this div that has like, it's got an overlay and then they've got another one that's holding the image in it. Yeah, and then this is below it is another div with the interview details, which again, has a link wrapping the H1. That's crazy.
So are you saying if you put a pseudo element on a button and have that be like the overlay, that the whole thing would be clickable like the button?
Yeah. So you can take the button and put a before and after on it. And as long as the container is position relative and the button is position static, you can set that after pseudo element to be position absolute with top left, bottom right, 0. And it'll take up the whole thing. And if you click anywhere, it'll basically take that button. It also means if you like tab to it, it like handles everything for you, including focusing and stuff. It's interesting, but it does make it so you can't select text. They've already opted for that option anyway, so that's a better solution. But they've got a lot of divs here, and they're using this as a background picture, I think, so they can control the way that it fits. But you can do a lot of that with CSS. If you put an actual image in there and put object fit on it. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but basically object fit is something that you put on the containing element for an image. And then it's on the image itself, but it has to have width 100%, height 100%, and then you tell it how you want it to fit inside of its container. But that container has to be positioned. It's got to be position relative, or whatever it is, whatever you need. But I would probably use a figure in this case for most of these images. So if you've got an article,
Question. So how are you gonna do this button thing and select text? That's what I was.
How do you do the button and select text? You could do it by making the text sit higher than the button pseudo element. But then that would mean if you clicked the text, it wouldn't actually do the link thing. So they're going for, if you click anywhere on it, navigate, and then the text isn't selectable, because if you wanted to make the text selectable and still do that, it would just mean that the text wouldn't actually work. It would break that behavior. So depends on what you want to do. You could get the best of both worlds by just taking everything inside of it besides the pseudo element and putting it a little higher with the z index of 1. So you could just do, in this case, article star z index 1. Yeah. As long as it's not the button, I mean. Do any of you do a lot with pseudo selectors? Do you know what I mean by that? Anyone? Yeah. You do. Which one do you use a lot?
Not.
Yes, I use not all the time. You can select everything except a specific thing. Like if you don't want the first child or you don't want the last child, but everything else should have the same style, you just, it looks like. It basically looks like this. You would just do not first child, right? And that's a valid CSS selector that would, whatever element you're attaching that to, it would get all of those except for the first one inside a container. Well, the first child. If you wanted the first one, you do first and type. Yeah, I mean, this one's pretty well laid out, but there's one more I want to take a look at because this one's interesting. It's also more of a marketing website, but they've got this kind of crazy effect going on here. And I actually tried this website with a screen reader, and there's nothing. It's impossible to navigate. It doesn't. You can't even find anything on the page. Like you tab into it, and it all it gives you is the title, which is the title that's set in the head. You know, the one that shows up in the tab bar there. That was awesome. But this one here, like how would you set up something like this? This is kind of a tricky one. That's not really straightforward, and it is purely visual. So you'd still want all that text to always be like accessible to bots, right? What are your thoughts on how you would go about doing something like that? It's got all these little moving pieces. That's a tough one. This is why I brought it up. I'm not entirely sure how I would do it, honestly. But I know I wouldn't do it like this. Here, let's see all the speakers because this is even better. There are a lot of them. So we've got this page where you have this nice grid. Everything looks cool. But if we inspect it, it tells a different story. It's div with an A tag around a div, which is not valid HTML. A tags can only have phrasing content. Div is not phrasing content. And actually, P tags can only have A tags in them if A tags. Sorry, actually I'm wrong. A tags can have flow content in them. A div technically counts. But you can't put an A tag inside of a P tag unless that A tag only has phrasing content. Because a P tag can only have phrasing content. Anyway, in any case, they've got that A similar to what they're doing, except they actually wrapped it around the div instead of doing what you normally do. So, but this text is also still not selectable. But then they've got this inner div, and then this logo speaker div with an image, which is just the logo, because they're animating that in and out. It's just positioned inside of here. The image is a background image. And then the actual thing you want is a div with divs, with text in them. And that's the thing that's positioned and it animates in and out, right? So that's definitely not the best approach to that. What do you think you could do? Even just taking what they've done and just using semantic elements instead.
So then would be an article to start with.
Yeah, it's an article. I mean, there's not a lot of content in it, but it's something that would make sense on its own, I think. If You just
Yeah, and like in each grid element is what I mean.
Okay. What about this? If this was what was actually showing up here and not animated in, what elements do you think you'd use? That's this content, this chunk right here.
5 heading tag, the M tag.
Yeah, this would actually be a fun one to play around with. I would bet you could do exactly what they're doing with just an article, with this being the content inside of it, and this whole animated background is just a pseudo element. Because all you need is for that to be on top of your image. You get that by default if you use an after or a before. It's actually going to sit on top of a background image all the time. And then you would just push everything else on top of it with the Z index, right? That would work. That would make this a lot less content here. But you still have this weird guy right here, image. And that's an interesting one because they've got it inside of this div. I'm assuming to control size. But you really don't need that div. You could just stick that image directly in there on its own without a wrapping element, right? Because you can still put all the same styles on the image that you can put on div. Unless they're trying to force it to be a certain size, you need a containing element. Again, I'm not against using divs and spans. I'm just against using them when you're wrong. It's not always easy. This is one of those ones that's kind of tricky. Anytime you're doing stuff with a lot of motion or where it's just kind of there. Slack was another one. They're looking at. There's a lot of crazy stuff potentially going on. I mean, each of these right here, you could totally make an article, right? But I don't know if that's the best use of an article. But this guy would definitely be an aside. If you're talking about just the whole structure right here, I'm thinking this guy over here. So here's your page. This is your nav. Actually, sorry, header with nav inside it. And then this piece over here is your main. And it has its own header, which is relative to the area that you're at, because that's kind of a channel or conversation header. And then you got an aside here, and this is your feed. So you could have articles in there for each of those things. But this is the stuff that gets a little tricky. It's all the emojis, right? And that kind of stuff. This is easy. We've learned some cool stuff for this. You got an avatar that's just, you could put that inside a figure. And then your title, the time, and then a bunch of paragraphs, or in that case, this piece right here. What would you do for that? Yeah, it could be, it's not a code block, but it looks like a pre-formatted block. You could use a pre-tag, and that would preserve the spacing that someone typed in. You could style it up, kind of like that. Anyway, that's it. Thanks. Use Semantic HTML. Anyone have any questions?
How does semantic HTML work inside of, like, say you wrapped your Angular app electron? Does it?
Yes.
Yeah, just hypothetically speaking.
If you were using like VoiceOver on Mac or you're using the screen reader, it's just Chrome, so it would behave exactly like Chrome would.
Okay.
The part that they would be interfacing with is a browser. It would read exactly the same. So I don't know if you've noticed in like if you're using VS Code, if you are testing stuff with VoiceOver on and you tab back to VS Code, it will start reading your VS Code stuff to you because they've made VS Code accessible. You can code blind if you want to. And it's because this is also Electron. This is just Chrome. And so they put in the effort to make even something as complex as this accessible by using semantic markup and also probably a whole bunch of ARIA attributes for stuff that just doesn't have semantic equivalents. Any other questions? Okay, thanks.
But we have some.